General and dear students, I hope you all are fine. Stay home, stay safe, and follow the rules of SMS. At this time, now we are going to start a new chapter, and the name of the chapter is The Enemy, which is written by Pearl S. Buck. Before starting the chapter, I'd like to tell you what the message the writer wants to give us. Here, the main theme of racism is reflected in the story in several ways. When Dr. Sadao, the first incident is when Dr. Sadao, he recalls how he met Hannah, his wife. He remembers that he didn't become serious with her until he was sure that she had been pure in her race, because otherwise his father wouldn't have approved. Here I mean to say had been pure in her race, it means that she would have been a Japanese. Otherwise his father would have refused. The second incident is Yumi. Yumi, she refused to touch the American. Yumi is the servant in Dr. Sadao's house. She refused to touch the American, let alone wash him before the operation. And then when he left, she cleaned the guest room thoroughly, simply to get the white man's smell out of it. Sadao, he also himself had a very strong feeling about white people. He thinks to himself that they are quite repulsive and that it was a relief to be openly at war with them. He also believed that Americans, they were full of prejudice, and it had been bitter to live in knowing himself their superior. Now, with the backdrop of Second World War, the author here, he highlights the horrors of war by portraying the helpless American sailor who was quite tortured. Here, the author also advocates universal brotherhood and highlights that service to the wounded is the best service to humanity. The story underlines the message that doctors, they don't have any nationality. They must rise above all petty issues like Dr. Sadao did and make all possible efforts to save human life. So now students, let's get started. So students, The Enemy. This chapter is written by Pearl S. Buck. Before starting with the chapter, I'd like you all to know about the author. Pearl S. Buck. She was born in 1892 and died in the year 1973. She was an American writer and a novelist. She had a Chinese name, Sai Zhenzu, as she spent her childhood in China, being the daughter of missionaries. Her novel, The Good Earth, it won a Nobel Prize in Literature for her. Buck had a humanistic attitude to the problems of life. And before moving on with the chapter, I'd like you all to know about the characters. I'll introduce you all with the characters that are being involved in this chapter. The first character, or we can say so, the protagonist of the story is Dr. Sadao. Dr. Sadao Hoki. He is a Japanese surgeon and a scientist also. He was brought up by his father, who was a staunch Japanese and devoted to his culture. Dr. Sadao, he became a skillful doctor and scientist simply to fulfill his father's wishes. His father he sent him to America to study medicine because he wanted him to study for the benefit of the country. Dr. Sadao also helped his father as he didn't even marry Hannah without his father's approval. He was so skilled that the general was totally dependent on him. The general, he had blind faith in Dr. Sadao, and this exemplifies him as a skillful and expert surgeon. The next comes is Hannah. Hannah is an ideal wife, mother, and a true Japanese. She is true patriot and humanitarian with a compassionate heart. She is Dr. Sadao's wife, who helps her husband in operating on the American despite her physical discomfort. The third character is Tom. Tom is an American. He is a typical American soldier, thinking that most Japanese are cruel and are not human. The last character is of the general. General, he is a selfish old man. He only wanted Sadao to make him recover from the illness which he was suffering from. Now comes about the story. So, dear students, about the story is somewhat the introduction of the story. In this story, we'll meet a person named Dr. Sadao, who is a Japanese surgeon. He once finds a wounded American soldier on the beach near his house. He is unable to throw him back, though he was his enemy. As he was a doctor, his first duty was to save a life. So, he risks his honor, career, position, and life by sheltering a war prisoner. The dilemma Dr. Sadao faced was none of his doing or creation, and it was the biggest dilemma a gentleman could ever face. He was a patriotic Japanese, and his duty was to hand over the American pilot prisoner to the police at once. Else, he would be called a traitor. That would be the ruin of himself, his family, his credit, and reputation. At the same time, he was a dedicated medical man whose very first duty was to save a life as far as possible. Luck was also on his side that Dr. Sadao could emerge absolutely unscratched from such a very tricky situation. The enemy's life could be saved without deviating from the right path. This chapter, The Enemy, is a gripping novella from the start to the very finish. So now let's get started. Here, in the first part of the chapter, the writer, he introduces the main character of the story, Dr. Sadao Hoki. Dr. Sadao's house was situated on the coast of Japan. He had been living there since his childhood. The house had a low height and was made of stone. It was set upon the rocky beach, which had a boundary line made with pine trees that were tilted towards one side. When Dr. Sadao he was a child, he used to climb upon those pine trees. On his visit to the South Seas, he would see men doing so that they could pluck the coconut from the trees. There, he used to accompany his father to the islands of the South Seas often. His father would point towards the island and would say that those were the stepping stone towards the future of Japan. Dr. Sadao, as he was a child, so out of curiosity, he would ask where would they reach from those islands? And then his father, he would say that it was not known as it depended on the future. The future, it had no limits. It depended on mankind, how it shaped its future. Now, Sadao, he retained all the things that his father would tell him as a child because his father, he never played or joked with him. He was not a playful man. Dr. Sadao and his father, they shared a very mature relation. And his father, he underwent a lot of hardship to bring Dr. Sadao up. Dr. Sadao, he knew that his father's sole concern was his education. So, at the age of 22, he was sent to America to study surgery and medicine. And then he returned back at the age of 30. Before dying, Dr. Sadao's father saw him become famous not only as a surgeon but also as a scientist because he was on a way to discover a treatment for wounds which would make them absolutely clean. So, as he was a scientist also, so he was not sent abroad with the armed forces as a doctor, as he was being retained by the general because the general was suffering from an ailment which would need to be operated upon in case of an emergency. Now here, the writer he describes the scene outside Dr. Sadao's house as the days were usually warm and the sea waves were cold. So the nights they became foggy. Dr. Sadao, one day as he was sitting out, he saw the boundary of a nearby island became invisible gradually because of the fog. Slowly, the mist, it was coming closer to him. Soon, there would be mist all around his home. So at that time, when his house will be totally encircled with the mist, then he would go back into the house to his wife Hannah, who was waiting for him along with two children. Before Dr. Sadao could go inside, the door opened and his wife looked out for him. She was wearing a dark blue colored gown over her dress. She lovingly came and crossed her arms with Dr. Sadao's arms, smiled at him, but remained silent and stood by his side. That's all, dear student, for today's lecture. I hope you were able to understand it. Thank you.